Welcome back to Upstream. We're here this afternoon with Fiona of the Sovereign Tech Fund and Mirko of Linux Foundation Europe. I would try to say their last names, but I know I'll butcher them. So we're going to be talking here this afternoon about how governments, particularly in Europe, are starting to figure out how to support and manage open source. There's a little bit of a carrot and a stick, is the English metaphor for it, going on here. The mix of support and regulation. Both of these are somewhat new to open source. We've been mostly unregulated and, for better for worse, mostly unsupported by governments for the past 20 years. And so folks are trying to figure out, how do we make that work? And so I'm really excited to have Fiona and Mirko here today to talk about that. Fiona, why don't you kick us off a little bit? Tell us a little bit about Sovereign Tech Fund, or as folks will have probably heard, seen online, STF is the common acronym for it. What does it do? How did it originate?
Sure. So thank you very much for inviting me. Happy to and excited to talk about the Sovereign Tech Fund. The Sovereign Tech Fund is an organization that we started a couple of years ago. So in 2022, in fact, and our mission is to strengthen the open source ecosystem in the public interest. And we are funded by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. We originated actually a couple of years further back in 2020. So a couple of team members, myself and my co-founder Adriana Groh, we worked in open source funding in the past. And there were a couple of things that we identified as gaps in the technology and innovation and open source funding that we worked in or that we saw in the landscape, which is there wasn't a good deal of support available for open source infrastructure, which is specifically what we support, or for the maintenance of these core technologies. So what the Sovereign Tech Fund does is we invest in precisely these core technologies. We call it open source infrastructure. So these are the technologies that are often overlooked, but that are needed for every developer to build software. That is libraries, program languages themselves, the infrastructure needed for program languages, compilers, all these core and developer tools, all these core technologies that are really vital and critical for any imaginable software development.
Yeah, I mean, this any imaginable part, I think, is going to be one of the recurring themes of today, which is that it's very hard to build without some of these technologies that you're supporting. So thank you for that work. Mirko, you're not originally a government person, and yet you've ended up doing a lot of work with government, especially in the past year. How'd that happen?
Well, kind of by accident, in a way. I work at Linux Foundation Europe, which is the European chapter of the Linux Foundation. We're based in Brussels, and normally our job is to support the open source projects and the communities and contributors that work in Europe. But when the initial draft of the Cyber Resilience Act was published, it contained language that we thought had the potential to harm open source development in general. So we had to get engaged, and I took care of that. Thankfully, this did have the desired effect. We basically saw updates to the original draft that turned the Cyber Resilience Act from a potential risk to the open source community to, I think, an opportunity to embrace it and to mature for the community as well. And yeah, so that's how I ended up being in Brussels a lot, having a lot of conversations with policymakers, and wearing a jacket and a tie.
Oh no, not a jacket. I wear the tie irregularly enough now that I have to take a picture of it for the company Slack, so that they believe I still own any ties when I wear one. For those who haven't followed along, we talked a little bit at Upstream last year, and I talked a little bit in my introductory talk this morning about the CRA. But why don't you tell folks who may have missed some of that a little bit more about what the Cyber Resilience Act is and why it was so important?
Mm-hmm. So it's a horizontal regulation by the European Union for its internal market. This means that everybody who offers digital products in Europe makes them available commercially has to abide by this regulation. This is one of the key aspects. It affects everybody, no matter where your business is located or where your community is located, because you probably have operations or business in Europe. So that's one aspect. And then what it regulates is, the cybersecurity of digital products that are introduced in the market, with the goal to generally reduce vulnerabilities, to ensure that maintainers actually maintain and fix bugs in their products for the life cycle of the product. And also, to common theme in Europe, enable consumers to make smart decisions about products, like which to buy based on transparent information about how secure they are. Everybody agrees with these policy goals. The questions were more with how they're implemented, which entities are assigned what responsibilities. And we initially felt that too much of that responsibility fell into the upstream communities. And as I said, this has changed, and so now it's different. So maybe one more thing that is very interesting about the Cyber Resilience Act is that it's the first law that introduces a separation between manufacturers and open source software stewards, as it's called there, which talks about big projects and foundations and things like that. So now, for the first time, the structure of the setup of our open source ecosystem is actually represented in the law as separate from industry, and that's great, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely, if we don't get to that, by the end of this talk, that distinction, which is a really important one, we'll definitely make sure that we share out some links for listeners as well. Fiona, I mean, what do you think? I mean, Mirko just laid out, I think, pretty clearly what the goals of the CRA are in terms of providing additional information, transparency. On your side of things, what are the primary goals of the folks that you're working with in government, your funders and other folks you're working with?
So I think one important definition that we have, or maybe distinction that we have, is, or rather the lack of distinction, is we see digital infrastructure the same way that we see physical infrastructure. So the Sovereign Tech Fund is funded 100% by the German government, and we invest public money into open source infrastructure because it is in the public interest to support these. And I think there are a lot of parallels to be made, and we think that this support or this investment in open source infrastructure should be seen also on the long term, the same way that we invest in physical infrastructure. And we want there to be public investment. We want this to be complementary to other kinds of investments that are there. I mean, we also talked about this before, the work that Tidelift is doing, the work that potentially also companies are doing, investing in open source infrastructure, as we all benefit from it. But I do think there's a point to be made that there should also be public investment. And with the Sovereign Tech Fund, we're trying to push for an example what this could look like. We're trying to learn a lot how public investment could work in the open source infrastructure and in the open source ecosystem. I think one thing that I want to flag and that I've been thinking more about in the past, as we are also often asked about how it actually works, how the Sovereign Tech Fund invests, it's an important distinction to make because we don't provide grants. And it's a question that I receive more and more in the past, why we don't provide grants, why it's not donations. But we actually, we purchase labor on these critical technologies. So we provide service, we close service agreements with the maintainers of open source infrastructure. And I think it's important to make it clear that this is not seen as charity. It's not seen as something, where we provide a donation, but it's actually extremely critical work that I also don't want to coin as, it's philanthropic work to invest in it. I think there's a place to be held for philanthropic investments as well, thinking about all these pieces of the puzzle that need to be there, because securing open source infrastructure is a really heavy lift and we need as many actors as we can have. But I've been thinking more and more about this distinction and why it's important to make it clear that we don't provide grants, but we see it as an investment where we get the return, which is the infrastructure that we all rely on is secured.
That is such an important distinction and such a hard one to make, I can say from experience. I want to dig in on one thing that you said there. that analogy, certainly a recurring theme of today and of a lot of discussions I think that people are having inside the movement right now, is that, boy, this is an infrastructure shared by the entire economy, right? It is very much like highways or trains or electrical grids. And yet that is somewhat, that analogy can sometimes be challenging for people to, like, at some levels they're like, oh yes, of course, this makes a lot of sense, and at other levels not so much. Do you see pushback on that, or do you see gaps around that you wish that analogy were better accepted or better understood?
So for me personally, or in the narratives that we are building, it has been actually quite helpful, but probably not talking about the abstract concept of infrastructure, but really digging deeper and telling people. So we all use bridges. We all think they're super important. We don't let these being built by volunteer people that do it in their free time. Creating, like, anchoring the stories that we tell in the everyday life of people, I think is actually really helpful. There was also this paper published, I think 1 or 2 years ago by, I have to look it up, but it was a paper that went into and compared open source infrastructure to different realms or domains of what infrastructure or public goods could be, which is water, air, and then also physical infrastructure, as I mentioned before. I'm happy to dig up the link. And I thought that was really interesting because every single part of that narrative brings up another question. For example, also, we have public infrastructure or investments in making sure that the water that we all consume is filtered and cleaned, and that it is safe. And we have the same, and I think there are lots of interesting thoughts that come up when we talk about infrastructure and how it was built and how it was maintained and what kind of theoretical or state logic and thinking went into it, and that brought us the infrastructure that we have today and the structure to maintain it. I often actually think that we could dive deeper into these historical comparisons. If I had a lot of time, I would actually love to give a talk at one point, write a book, or just write a paper or a blog post about how open source infrastructure relates to the way that we build railways in the past, or the way that we build antennas, or telecommunication infrastructure, because I think there's a lot to unpack here. And I think the more we can anchor those things in people's lives, the better. Because as you all know, talking about open source infrastructure is hard because you never think about it unless something goes wrong. It's always hard to talk about preventative care instead of fixing bugs and security. We talk about it when something bad happens.
Right. I mean, that use of analogy, and I want to join you on that. I want to co-author that paper with you. The traditional, I would say, people who are not experienced in our space have to understand this stuff by analogy. Mirko, you mentioned that in the beginning of the CRA process, a lot of this was understood by reference to manufacturers or to putting things in the flow of commerce. And we had to, in the process, the CRA carved out a sort of new category. Were there any observations or learnings for you from trying to explain why this was all different? Why this didn't quite fit the old mental models?
Yes, of course. There were mental models that people had on kind of what does the supply chain look like for generally digital products, from people writing code, but also from basically people digging up the earth to make chips from that. It all was a very commercial model. Consumers, producers delivering to each other until price ended up with the end users. The problem with that model is that it doesn't have an idea of an upstream that is shared and where the results are a common good, a public good. And that's something we have to explain a lot. For example, that there's actually kind of a reverse in direction between contributing upstream and then somebody taking code from upstream and starting to integrate it into the products. One goes to upstream and one goes one direction goes towards the consumer. But once we explained that, and this is where you were right, that people need this kind of mental model and analogies and how this works. Once we explained this, things got better. So that we could, for example, explain that a developer, even if that developer is working for company X who fixes a bug upstream, doesn't necessarily do that so that they can consume it immediately, but maybe they just ran into it, fix it, and it will be available to everybody else, that bug fix. And this idea that the supply chain has two directions, especially in software, I think it stuck, and it started to be reflected in the law. So I think it's important that we write up these things. And of course, there are limitations to using the infrastructure concept when you talk about software, especially because there's a difference between developing the software and operating it. So infrastructure, when we talk about software infrastructure, is mostly stuff that we run for, like public e-services for citizens or telecommunication networks. But software is written once and then is there. So the analogy works and it helps people understand what we need to do. But there's more to it. So we probably still need to develop more complex mental models for that.
Yeah. Or at least simple models that have some distinctions. Fiona, were you going to add something?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, props to Atlantic Council who published the paper Avoiding the Success Trap. Interesting paper to read. It's short and it's nice. And I guess the one really blatant shortcoming of using infrastructure as a metaphor or comparing it is, I mentioned before, you wouldn't want a bridge to be built by volunteers. Fact is, open source infrastructure is mainly built by volunteers. So I just came up with this came to my mind because Mirko mentioned the supply chain analogies that we were using that are also having the shortcoming of there are a lot of people that never enter a contract with you. They build stuff, and this will continue to be the backbone of open source infrastructure, will always be volunteers, no matter how much money we have available, how many programs to support them. And these are important. They are one puzzle piece for making us all more sustainable. It's just that the way that it is right now, that oftentimes people don't have a choice and they have to stay volunteers even if they can't, and there's no additional support available. I think that is the big difference that we have to make sure exists in the mental models that people have. And when we talk about infrastructure and we use these words, is that eventually there will always be volunteers. And yes, they are going to build and fix the bridge that we're all running over.
Yeah, well, that two-way, that lack of a contract was one of our big themes of the Upstream conference last year, right? What we call the accidental supply chain, where people wake up one morning and they're part of a supply chain. It doesn't always have all the same things that governments or businesses are used to. Let me change gears a little bit here. Because I think, you mentioned, Fiona, that there are, of course, always volunteers here. And one of the frequent strengths and occasionally weaknesses or challenges of open is this sort of cross-community collaboration between volunteers, between different groups with a lot of different motivations. So I wanted to ask, how are you two working with others in this space? And Fiona, in my notes, I call this the grants space, but I want to, do you have, because there's so many there's NLNet, Open Collective, slightly different framework, lots of bounty platforms, but I don't have a great label for it if we're not using grants. I mean, do you have a way you're thinking about that space, and how are you thinking about the interaction between those platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we called it generally the support mechanisms that are out there and the actors that are willing to support in a meaningful way. And there are definitely grant makers. There are philanthropic organizations or organizations that work like philanthropic organizations. Generally speaking, I would say that the landscape has really changed, and we're hoping for this sort of tectonic shift that is necessary. And the Sovereign Tech Fund is definitely a contribution to that, making it clear to everyone, we made it, the German government made it. We came up with this program and it works, and there are less excuses now. Back when we started working on this in 2018, recently, there were maybe 2 or 3 organizations that we knew of that were specifically investing money into the development and maintenance, or not even maintenance, of open source infrastructure. So I think the narrative has really moved forward. More and more people are aware. Yes, it might have took another Log4j for that to happen. But I think and I often say a lot what happened after Log4j should have happened after Heartbleed, but it takes time, I think, or it took time, too much time for a lot of organizations to realize when it's necessary. So there are shifts and there are changes. I sometimes wish there was more and things would be moving faster. I might be a bit impatient, but I do think there's a lot of conversations happening, and now I'm really waiting for like big shifts and new organizations, new funds coming into place and investing. But I do think that we are on the right track. We just have a little bit of way before us. But I do see movement on the EU level. I see, and I would be also interested in your perspective here. I see more and more companies also at least challenging themselves and trying to figure out how to invest. The Sovereign Tech Fund has, curiously, not something that I would have expected, become an organization that companies also tend to, or other kinds of institutions, to understand how we manage to invest. It seems sometimes to be, the challenges seem sometimes a bit more trivial than I would have thought. A company just doesn't know how, or there's just no budget item available, or they don't know how to identify the appropriate contractor, or they can't donate anywhere. So, but I think more and more structures come into place, with more fiscal hosts and sponsors and foundations being created. So there are shifts happening, and that's a positive thing. The other thing that I would say, we are involved in a lot of conversations, which is good, because I think what's absolutely necessary and critical and fundamental for whatever that's happening is that we are well aligned and coordinated. Because I think there's a point to be made. If everyone is now jumping on this topic, which would be great, and we're not there yet at the point where there's too much funding available or too much support, that's great, but I think we should make sure that we are well coordinated, because there might be a potential harm also buried in there for the field. If we just throw money into that field, we are not well coordinated, we are not organized. I think it's really critical that we do this in a well orchestrated way, and we do get in touch with each other, we talk with each other, because I do think that every actor and every potential institution, organization is going to be able to offer something else, and that's good. A U-level fund is going to be able to offer something else than a quick and agile working little company that is doing little donations, and those are all going to be complementary, but we should make sure that this is really the case.
Well, I mean, it certainly you mentioned Heartbleed and why didn't this happen after Heartbleed? And I think both to give some credit and to there were some efforts, but I don't think there was a lot of, I think some very well-intended and sometimes well-funded efforts, but there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of knowledge sharing after about what worked and what didn't, or at least not in a formal sense, right? There was a lot of hallway conversations about, hey, this is what worked at CII, this is what didn't. So I hope that we can do better this time around on sharing that knowledge of what experiments work, what experiments don't work. I mean, speaking of that kind of knowledge sharing, Mirko, there were a lot of groups organized to push back on the CRA and try to change its structure over the course of the past year. Open Forum did a lot of work. I want to give them a lot of credit. Eclipse did some very early work in raising the warning flags. And now there is an even bigger, CRA is not done. The implementation, for those who are not following closely, the implementation is going to involve drafting of something like 40 different standards for how CRA gets turned into real world impact. And that's going to require, obviously, a lot of different input from folks in our community. So can you tell us a little bit about both how people did get involved? Like, what did we see over the past year? Any good lessons we can take from that? And how can people get involved going forward?
So, I mean, one thing that the open source community is good at is collaboration. We just sometimes need a little nudge to actually do it, because we tend to focus on the things that are important to us at the moment. And that nudge came with the initial draft of the Cyber Resilience Act. That basically told us, wait, there's a topic here that is not what we would normally do, which is like get engaged in policy discussions. But apparently we need to do it. And then this woke up a broad coalition, I would say, of organizations like the Rust Foundation, Python Software Foundation, all the well-known open source foundations in general, but also different companies that are, for example, involved in developing Upstream. And we got together and we started to collectively submit our feedback to the European Commission. And this had two effects. One is it required us to actually work through where would we disagree, what is the common, the consensus on the feedback. That made, I think, the feedback more substantiated. And the other effect is that there was less to read on the receiving end. So not like 30 different organizations submitted 30 different pages, but we submitted 3. And the feedback we got from that is that this really had a big impact, because when we submitted an opinion, then it was brief, it was well thought out, and it was actually read. So collaboration works, I would say, in this context. And we're now continuing this. So we're working with that industry group that is forming around the Eclipse Foundation to develop or contribute to the development of the standards that will be, they will define a lot of the implementation details of the Cyber Resilience Act. So it's very important. So yes, I mean, in the end, it's all about engaging in a field that is not familiar to us, I would say. But we like grew to the challenge, I would say, and it worked out really well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say lurking for a fair bit of it, trying to occasionally nudge about solo maintainers, and it was, I wouldn't say it was fun necessarily, but it was very satisfying, right? It was because it was certainly it wasn't fun because it was under pressure, and we all perceived that the negative impacts would be potentially very bad. Actually, I want to ask you about that. You know, I think we through that work, the community, as you already mentioned, introduced some formal concepts of open source, introduced this critical concept of a steward, of an open source steward, that I think is going to be increasingly important in open source going forward. What can you say a little bit more about stewardship, and what kinds of projects you think are going to ultimately end up being much more impacted by the CRA? What kinds of projects are probably going to be less impacted?
Mm-hmm. So the concept that was introduced in the Cyber Resilience Act is called Open Source Software Steward, and it basically describes organizations that operate in a non-profit approach and feel responsible for specific free and open source software projects. The text literally uses the term free and open source software. And that really recognizes a distinction between a commercial company that is primarily interested in, their commercial interest, and an organization that feels responsible for open source projects without directly gaining commercial benefit from it. And so the definition of steward basically covers, all the larger umbrella organizations and foundations. It covers formal organizations, foundations that run specific projects like the KDE community, Rust, Python, and others. It doesn't cover individuals who work as volunteers to, for example, maintain a small project. So there's a certain understanding that stewardship requires a bit more of an organization around it and more perpetuity. And this is, I think, also what will define the different impacts that this will have on the ecosystem. I think first of all, because there are obligations towards or expectations, not just obligations, towards managing vulnerabilities, fixing them, being responsive, making new releases, being transparent about kind of the known state of the software that we release, and all of that. So there's a certain administrative overhead, and this is, of course, easier to manage for larger organizations, and probably just overhead for a single part-time maintainer. And so this is not a question just of what are the legal responsibilities. It's a question that the bar is raised for what are the expectations towards the quality of the software. And if like the worst situation that you can be in is if you have a hobby project that you really care about, and because it's really great, it starts to become like digital infrastructure. People are starting to use it everywhere, but you still want to work it like it's your hobby project. This may become quite difficult in the future. But we also have to ask, in this situation, it's a sign of success, but do we then think that this idea of a part-time maintainer running this project, that's a viable, sustainable, long-term model? So the impact will be expectations towards governance and the performance of communities will rise. And some projects will be very happy about this. It encourages manufacturers also to engage with the projects. And some projects will find this administrative overhead difficult to manage.
Yeah. Fiona, have you all at STF given much thought yet to how that interacts with your model? When you know, the fee for services that I think correctly is a viewpoint that you want to put forward and model seems to be perhaps in some tension. I mean, you could imagine folks taking that approach, taking some of your contracts and perhaps being worried about that creating additional burdens under the CRA. Have you talked about that internally?
Yes, we have. And we have a bunch of questions that we're actually currently trying to clarify, or at least raise our concerns with context that we have in the European Commission. So one of the main concerns that we have, and I think we are not aware of any legal clarifications of when people become manufacturers. So as far as I know, this is one of the key points that we're a little bit worried about and that we're trying to currently clarify. So specifically for the people that we support and that end up in a service agreement with us, this is something that we're trying to address, making sure that there's a clear delineation, or in the implementation, there's either very clear guidance on what that means and clarification, because not everyone who works on a specific part of an open source component should be considered a manufacturer if they, in any place and time, make an earning with that or write an invoice. So those are the questions that we have. But generally speaking, we are watching the space for sure, and we're. But I would say I think a lot of work has went into that, and I've been quite in awe seeing the process around how the different organizations, Linux Foundation, Open for You, and so on, have gathered together. And I know that they are also currently looking for for different kinds of input to accompany the process, what it's going to look like. So I think I'm personally, and correct me if my impression is wrong, Mirko, but I think it's a good time right now to leave a little bit the panic mode and to figure out and become really active and engage and raise the concerns that we have. There's now a dialogue open, the door open, and so I would say the concerns we have and the questions, we have an avenue to clarify them, which I think is a huge, even just for that, it's been a huge improvement, and I think we're going to benefit from that for the years to come.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I think it's really not a time for panic. Last year, May, was a time for panic, and we did panic, and we rose and said, wait, that goes in the wrong direction. Now, if you look at not just what the text says, but also, for example, what was said last week in the Secure Open Source Software Summit that we had in Brussels, the Commission was there, and they said the CLA is purposefully like designed in a way to encourage manufacturers through the mandatory support period, through the obligation that they have to fix security vulnerabilities throughout at least 5 years, or even longer if the lifetime of the product is longer, to encourage them to work with the upstream communities, to work in the way the open source ecosystem is supposed to work. That means upstream first if you fix bugs, and to also make an obligation for them to make sure that the projects are viable over a long period of time and not just consume. And that, you talked initially about like carrot and stick. It's a stick, but it's a subtle one. It's a gentle stick. But it's a quite clear direction that the Commission is trying to support the open source ecosystem here by giving obligations to manufacturers to, for example, report their security vulnerabilities that they find to upstream projects, to supply the fixes to them, to work with them, etc. So it's not time for panic. It's a time for analyzing this with a cool head and say, how can we evolve our ecosystem here to benefit from that? And I think there's a chance.
Yeah, I mean, that actually dovetails perfectly with the last question that I wanted to ask Fiona before we wrap up a little bit here, which is that, Mirko's talking about how this could lead to some changes in how, especially small projects that are growing, how they're thinking about this responsibility that they might be taking on. And you have talked about in other contexts how you want to encourage projects, how you want to use your carrots to encourage projects to mature, to become more sustainable in the long run. Do you want to talk a little bit about what kinds of things you are encouraging projects? Because you're not just, as you say, you're not just airdropping money onto people. You're giving them specific goals and projects to work with. Can you talk a little bit more about how that plays into sustainability?
Sure. And I think the past 1.5 or almost 2 years that I've been talking to developers, and when we get in touch with technologies or we get applications, those are actually extremely interesting conversations to have when you talk to a project or a maintainer or a contributor, and you have the conversation about what's necessary to really secure this project. And the answers are very, very different and I think whatever offers or support mechanisms we come up with, they need to be able to cater to the different needs that exist. So, for some projects, what they really need to do is go, like Daniel Stenberg from Curl did, go through 120 uncategorized bugs, go through those, categorize them, and eventually fix them. For others, and that's a very interesting story. So as we talked about before, what should have happened after Heartbleed? Log4j is a really interesting example. So Log4j happened end of 2021. We talked with them in 2023, and until then, they did not have a single full-time developer. Even after everyone really definitely knew they need Log4j, and most of them have not switched to a replacement. And yet we talked with them, and they explained to us, well, the past couple of years, they were always forced to do critical fixes. They could never do a proper code review, a proper code rewrite, work with code smell, and so on. So there are specific needs that are often usually never paid for by companies that usually like to invest in, feature development, but usually not in maintenance. So increasing the security of projects by investing in like the maintenance work, cleaning up code, increasing the maintainability of code could also lead to more contributors becoming part of the community, and hence strengthening also security and longevity of a project. And then for others, it's building up a proper security team or onboarding, doing community work. I think there are different, on a very technical level, there are different responses to what can make a project more sustainable. And it's been really interesting and very enlightening to have these conversations and to understand, yes, projects need money for the more time-based work actually than feature-based or milestone-based work sometimes.
Well, certainly that resonates a lot with what we do here at Tidelift. So I suspect you and I should have many more conversations about that one. But we are, in the meantime, running out of time. So I wanted to just end with, these are big changes we're talking about, right? Whether it's carrot, whether it's stick, It does seem like some of these changes are going to be coming down. Are going to be coming down to projects which can be sort of cause people to be pretty negative. So I wanted to end instead on, what are you each most excited about what's coming through these changes in open source? Mirko, you talked a little bit already about this change to that community manufacturer relationship. Are there other things that you're excited about, or you want to elaborate on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing is that I really see a push in evolving kind of community governance to rise up to these the challenges in the form of like a higher bar, higher expectations. And I think that's good. It helps the community mature further. But there's another one that I'm personally really excited about, because I've been doing a lot of research on the relationship, for example, of open source and standards development. This recognition that the open source ecosystem has received in the past year and with this draft basically means that a door has been opened. Until now, we've just been a part of the ecosystem of ICT, as it is called, and nobody regulated us specifically or thought about us specifically very much in the policy landscape. Now that door is open. We have specific obligations that are matching our community setup, and we will rise up to them. But that means that in the future, we can talk about the other areas where open source plays a specific role in the development of trustworthy software that is run, for example, for public e-services, in the development of standards, which is until now really done by writing specifications and hoping that some people implement them, where we work the other way around. I really hope that we can resolve the separation of contributors in private and public actors, where the public sector currently doesn't really play a strong role, even though what we create are public goods. So what I'm really excited about is that after we've been talking about this for 2 decades, I feel now the door is open and we see an evolving understanding of how open source contributes to society, and therefore opportunity to actually realize those possible benefits. So I'm actually really excited about this.
Fiona, you get the last word.
Thank you. Bit of a lame last word, but I want to echo what Mirko said, because I mean, it's true. I think the organizations that are dealing or that are working and advocating for open source, they are growing in strength and numbers. And I think also people that join these organizations, there are new interesting players on the field, like the Sovereign Tech Fund. But I think those organizations are also, as you can see and as you can tell, we are talking to each other, we are coordinating. I think, as I said before, the coordinated work on the CRA has been a great example, and it's been opening a lot of doors, as Mirko said. I think, as I said before, we still have a long way to go, but I see really significant shifts in the narratives that we have around open source, how we are talking about it. We see more governmental, coalition negotiations and coalition contracts and program parties clearly including open source, and also understanding and what open source is. Again, I think there's a long way to go that people really understand open source is not just a product, but it's really this underlying layer that we have behind everything. But more and more people are talking about it. I also think there's things that I would like to be excited about is I would like to continue seeing in the future is more and more maintainers having their voice heard in these conversations. I think in the past years, maybe 2 years or so, I think more and more people from the maintainers community have been actively also included in these. In the past, I think there's been an interesting growing community of policymakers around open source, and now those are merging a bit more and closing in with or making connections with the maintainer community. So I would like to see that more present. But I think we are in a very positive sense. Different organizations globally that are working on this. We are collaborating. We are aligning our goals in a very positive sense. yeah, and I think there is not just great development or shifts happening, there's actually an acceleration of most of the things that we want to see happening in this space.
Cool. Well, that's a great note to end on. I hope we can build all that together. So thank you so much again for your time today at Upstream. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing more from both of your organizations in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.